How are we doing, guys? It's Mr. Shrews. Today's LEQ is how does natural selection affect species? So you guys heard of natural selection before back in life science, that 7th grade science class. Now, natural selection is the main leading driving force of evolution. And we're going to take a look at today of natural selection, kind of refresh on what it is, what needs to occur for natural selection to occur, and kind of talk about more about fitness within that natural selection aspect. But first, there's a short, kind of like cartoonish video to help introduce natural selection and what we're going to be looking at today.
Charles Darwin developed his theories after his adventures upon the HMS Beagle. In his travels, he observed that creatures found on the islands he visited were similar to ones found on the mainland, but appeared to be slightly different. It wasn't until he returned home that he came to the conclusion that species are specially modified to their environments, and that's why they differ. He developed 4 conditions explaining why this happens. Darwin's theory of natural selection by descent with modification is testable and observable fact. Experiments have been conducted in the wild and in labs. Let's dive deeper into Darwin's 4 conditions. Condition number 1. Individuals within a population differ. There are features that differ within populations of the same animal. In our case, the feature that varies between our giraffes is neck length. Some giraffes were born with long necks, some were born with short necks. Condition number 2. The differences are, at least in part, passed from parents to offspring. Darwin's descent with modification is the idea that offspring are fairly similar to their parents, with some genetic differences. Condition number 3. Some individuals are more successful at surviving and reproducing than others. In the case of our giraffes, the long neck individual did not acquire its neck by stretching at the leaves. Instead, individuals within the population were born with a neck length that was longer than others. Because the longer neck allowed them to reach the food that was otherwise unattainable, it gave them an advantage. Condition number 4. The successful individuals succeed because of variant traits they have inherited and will pass on to their offspring. Giraffes with the longer neck advantage are in better health and able to pass this feature to their offspring. Because this trait is more successful than shorter necks, more individuals in the population have it. Over time, this process can result in populations that specialize for particular environments and may eventually result in emergence of new species. In other words, natural selection is an important process, though not the only process, by which evolution takes place within a population of organisms.
So that video was kind of a good introduction and refresher on natural selection. But when we talk about natural selection, what natural selection is, it's organisms who are better adapted to the environment tend to survive and reproduce more, aka survival of the fittest. So that's what Charles Darwin was explaining, that those who are the most fit are able to survive. Because notice here in the giraffe that the taller giraffe was able to adapt to the environment, have that longer neck to help them reach that food at the top. These other 2 giraffes, eventually those genes will kind of just leave that gene pool, and then more and more giraffes will be seen with that longer neck because those are the ones that are able to survive. And then moving on to those 4 conditions, they hit them already a little bit, but those 4 conditions are overproduction, genetic variation, struggle for survival, and different reproductive success. So overproduction basically is just organisms overproduce in the sense of offsprings. And we'll get into why that occurs, but it's very important that these 4 conditions happen for natural selection to occur. Because you want the strongest to survive, out of all those offsprings, only the strongest survive, so only the strongest genotypes will eventually keep moving on within populations and keep reproducing. Genetic variation, same thing that happened with the giraffes. There was genetic variation there. Those who had the long neck and those who did not have that long neck. So genetic variation leads to, once again, the more better able, the more fittest organism to survive. Struggle for survival. There has to be competition. If there's not competition, then it just leads to organisms just kind of not really having any type of fitness there. Because if there's competition, the more fit an organism is, the more likely that will survive. So it needs that struggle for survival. and then different reproductive success. Same thing. You want the most fit organisms to reproduce. So they'll be able to reproduce because they have the most fit genotypes. Whereas the other types of genotypes, like those shorter neck giraffes, will not be able to have reproductive success. And eventually there will be no longer shorter neck giraffes. They'll just be those taller ones because those are the most fit organisms. And then we kind of hit on fitness, and it's similar to natural selection, in the sense of the idea behind it, but fitness is just how good a particular genotype is able to survive and reproduce. So think about this picture here. We have this one bird who has a higher fitness and the one bird with the lower fitness. So the lower fitness is only able to produce 2 children, and these 2 children are able to only produce 4 grandchildren, whereas the higher fit organism is able to produce 4 children, and these 4 are able to eventually produce 16 children there. So the more fit the organisms, the more likely it's able to survive and reproduce. And that's based on that genotype there, that particular genotype. This higher fit bird has a different genotype than this lower fit bird. And you're able to see that because of the children and the grandchildren and how they're able to survive and reproduce. And then talking about overproduction, one of those 4 conditions for natural selection to occur. Organisms overproduce to ensure enough offspring are born so a species will survive. So take bunnies, for example. Bunnies overproduce. They want to make sure that these bunnies, that their species will survive. So they keep reproducing more and more species, or more and more offspring. Now, a lot of these offsprings don't survive. A lot of them die out quicker than others. But because they're able to produce so many, they're going to make sure that that species is able to move on and keep moving on throughout the years. So that's a big reason why natural selection occurs, is because the ones that did survive were the most fit of the bunnies, while the other ones were the least fit, which is why they died. And then moving to varying fitness, it's, the more fit an organism is, the more likely they'll survive. So that's just what does it mean by varying fitness? So if you look at that picture, you got the cheetah with optimal leg length, and then cheetah with longer legs. So granted, the longer legs may support greater speed, but they also may mean more fragile bones. Whereas this cheetah may have, the shorter leg, and it may not be able to run as fast, but those bones are not going to be as fragile as the other. So varying fitness is just the more fit an organism is, the more likely they'll survive. And so make sure you get down that summary for that LDQ. You're going to move on that left-hand page. You're going to have these couple different examples that you're going to kind of go through and then label each one there. But this is Mr. Striz signing out.